Subhadra Das, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How's it with you?
Very good. We are delighted to have you here with us today, and we're going to be jumping into a discussion about bias in science. And science is something that you've studied extensively about the history and the philosophy surrounding it. I'm interested to know, from what you've learned, what is your view of science at the moment?
For me, what science is a way of looking at the world that encompasses good things. It is critical. It is skeptical. It's based on an idea of reality. But I think the problem comes in when we start to realise, first of all, who gets to practice science, whose voice has greater authority, and who gets to define what science is.
Absolutely. And part of the reason why we really wanted to be having this discussion with you is because of your new book that's come out. So could you just tell our readers a little bit about it?
It's called Uncivilised, 10 Lies That Made the West. And altogether, it is a critique of the white supremacy baked into our idea of science particularly, but our idea of Western civilization. Each chapter takes its title from a lie, something that we take for granted in our lives or something that we take as being an objective truth or a good thing in our society. And I want to peel back our understanding really of where those ideas come from. And the very first chapter is called Nullius in Verba, which is Latin for take no one's word for it.
We know that science is a thing that's active in the world. Many of us take it for granted, many of us think with it, many of us have been educated by it. One way or another influences our lives. But the way we think about it today is an outcome of centuries-old processes. In its essence, it is a tool that we think with.
Yeah.
And as long as we use it as a tool to, work with our world, we can, like any other tool, you can come up to all sorts of very interesting and life-expanding things. You've got the title here, 10 Lies. Can you, say a bit more about what do we mean by these lies?
First one, as I said, Nullius in Verba, is about science. It's not necessarily an objective good in our society, as useful as it can be. Then comes knowledge is power. Who is our education for? What does it serve? Who is it building up and who is it breaking down? Then comes, this one's an abstract one, writing. So I said the pen is mightier than the sword. In the West, the importance of oral traditions has been completely excised. We are so embedded in the written world that we can't think beyond it. Number 4, justice is blind. Like I said, this one was pretty straightforward. Number 5, power to the people, democracy. There is an assumption within Western society that a liberal democracy is the best way to govern, for anyone to govern anyone. And I don't necessarily disagree, but I don't think we live in a democracy. 6, time is money. It's true, but time is also a trap. Number 7, your country needs you. Yeah, right. I think if we just look at the political situation right now, that's clearly not the case. Then we've got chapter 8, art for art's sake. I appreciate this is a science channel, you've got scientific people, but the two things are not disconnected. But I think the question I really wanted to ask was, what is art exactly? Chapter 9, death is the great equalizer. What I say is, in the West, it ruined death for everyone. Medical advancement, technology, all of these things, yes, they are prolonging our lives, but they're not necessarily prolonging either the quality of our lives or indeed our engagement. Brings me on, finally, to chapter 10, we're all in this together. Civilization has been this way of trying to divide people. It's a divide and conquer mechanism. Who is civilized, who is savage? And what I want to say is, let's stop focusing on these sorts of things that divide us, which are ideas to do with civilization, to do with race, and let's focus on what unites us instead.
There was a great little quote you had in there about your time working with the Galton collection, and how, to your mind, it blew everything you thought you knew about science out of the water. I know you've spoken a lot about this in public, but could you possibly do it again?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm very happy to. Because I'm very used to it. So my tagline is, Francis Galton is the most important and influential Victorian scientist no one has ever heard of. I was like, this must just be some obscure science. There's plenty of them. There's museum collections named for random dead white men all over the world. He's just another one of these. He's not. He's Charles Darwin's cousin. He's hanging out at the Royal Society. He's hanging out at all these other different clubs in London that are these science social clubs for rich white men in London. And he's hugely influential. He did seminal work in ideas to do with meteorology, with crime science, fingerprinting, statistics. He's one of the godfathers of modern genetics as well, which when we then think that Francis Galton in the year 1883, interestingly the year after Charles Darwin died, came up with the word eugenics, Suddenly this story starts to become bigger than we thought. My experience of eugenics is that it's not what a lot of people think it is, because back in the day, I thought it was Nazis, right? They did the bad things. We beat them in the Second World War. Eugenics is done now. That's what I thought. It's very much not the case. Eugenics never really went away. The reason it blew my ideas of science out of the water was I always thought science was something the good guys did. I had that kind of moralizing aspect about it. And I thought, UCL, where I used to work, one of the world's leading science organizations in terms of research, in terms of teaching, I thought we were the good guys. So suddenly, why am I looking at a piece of Nazi science equipment in a historical collection in a university in London?
Obviously today, if we speak about eugenics, most scientists, practicing scientists who are aware of it will dismiss it as a bygone era, a pseudoscience will be the phrase, and it's then swept aside. Do you see any particular danger with that?
If we look at medicine, for example, so much bad science and so much bad data about the nature of how of so-called race, how people are racialized, as it plays out in medicine, we can see the dangers. It's a matter of life and death. It's almost a cliche for me to trot out the statistic that black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women in this country. Denying that it was something that is still ongoing is disingenuous at best. The other thing is, this is an idea that hasn't died, or it hasn't actually lost popularity. So if I could, I'd like to recommend a book that was written by a friend of mine, Angela Saini, a book called Superior, The Return of Race Science. These are ideas that have trickled into the 21st century from the beginning of the 20th. And we're not talking that many generations of scientists. There are people who have not let go of these ideas. So to dismiss them out of hand, it's not great science, for one thing. But also, to not engage with these conversations means that we as the public lose out as well. There's a reason why we haven't heard these stories, is because the people who knew didn't talk about them in ways that were useful.
So why do you think it is that people are so willing to accept science in one direction and then not again?
Power. First of all, the reason why people held on to race in the aftermath of Darwin was he didn't let go of it terribly easily either. So while he was very committed to the idea that all humans are a single species, he nonetheless did maintain certain ideas of superiority, white superiority, as part of that. But we know that Charles Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection was controversial in its own time. Nowadays, the story we often hear about that was because it went against religion. There were religious people who did not want to believe in the commonality of species, or the fact that we were descended from apes, which is not strictly speaking true, but anyway, that's the kind of the conversation. Then we became cleverer as time went on, and all the scientifically minded people said, no, this is the correct thing. That wasn't the case. When Darwin puts his theory forward, one of the reasons he waited so long was because he knew he had to gather enough data and build a convincing enough argument to convince his own fellow scientists that what he was saying was true. Because the idea at the time was the different so-called races of humans were different species. So the clue is right there in the title of his book, On the Origin of Species. Where do species come from? What constitutes a species? And so what he was doing there was saying, you all are wrong, but by saying you all are wrong, what he was doing was he was pulling the rug out of a really massive idea, because saying that different types of humans are different types of species was a really great way for European people to say, those black people that we've been enslaving for the last couple of 100 years, that is the natural order of things. They are a lesser kind of human. All those fancy clubs that Darwin and Galton were going to were built on slave labor. And so what he was doing really was taking a crack at the foundations of that enormous edifice.
I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on, we don't typically learn about science in the context of the history that was going on at the time. Do you think that's something we really need to?
Yes, we do. And actually, I've got a question for you, which is, when did you know that history of science was a subject that you could study?
I discovered it when I was towards the end of my undergrad degree in history.
Yeah, you see, so you were already at university at the time. I was even further. I'd done undergrad and 2 masters. I was working by the time. I was like, there is a whole department called Science and Technology Studies. And I was like, but this is interesting. This is the stuff that I was interested in when I was in science class. And I would argue, when you know about Galton, and you know about where he was coming from in terms of the history of race science, when you know more about Charles Darwin and where he was coming from in the context of his ideas, everything else starts to make a lot more sense. The things you learn in science class and the things you learn in history class make a lot more sense when you think about them together than when you think about them separately.
One of the things that we deal with when we talk about power relations is there's how do we think about the person in power? How conscious are they of the power they're wielding? Do we imagine that there's a bunch of these white men sat in a place with curly moustache and top hats going, we will suppress, repress
that's true,
in a
right?
conscious level?
Yeah.
Or are they taking part in a process that is in themselves bigger than them, but are blinded to it because they are benefiting from it?
Let's say that they aren't mustache twirling, top hat wearing, although it sounds like a documentary to me,
To be fair, yes.
what you just described. What they were doing was they were saying, let us observe from nature, right? Let us look at the world and let us gather the data, and then we will draw our conclusions based on that. So they did. And what they saw was a world divided racially. So if they were looking at the Americas, what they saw was the genocide of Native Americans, what they saw was the enslavement of African people, and they saw white people in essentially lots of working class white people in the US, but then also like a very well established upper class. And so they were looking at that, and what they did, the question they didn't ask themselves was, to what degree is this the natural order of things? As far as they were concerned, what they were seeing was a natural situation. They didn't see that it was a political one. I'm not anti-science, I'm just anti-really sloppy science.
Yes.
Eugenic thinking widened race. So eugenic thinking is racist thinking, so it's based on race, but there are 4 other aspects we need to keep in mind at the same time. And in no particular order, they are disability, gender, class, and body size. And if you think about all of those things, but you have to think about them all at the same time because they intersect with each other. The assumptions that we make about certain people are based on those aspects of their identity. And when I say gender, I mean it in the widest possible sense. So gender, sexuality. Really the one that's still kind of outstanding. We talk about the first 4 fairly comfortably, but anti-fatness in our society is really something that we don't talk about to the degree that we should, partly because we moralize about fat people. We think that if somebody is fat, then that we cast a moral aspersion on them. There is something wrong with them. Fat people exist. They are here. There's nothing wrong with them. You can be healthy in a larger body. Yes, it's true that you can also not be healthy in a larger body, but you can't tell by looking at a person. If a person can't go to a restaurant because they don't know if the chair is going to support them, has to buy 2 tickets on an airplane because they know that the seats won't fit them. These are, like, I've chosen 2 very middle class kind of aspects to it, but these are actively impacting on people's lives in ways that are discriminatory. But this scientific way of looking at people still has these hangovers of this old morality stuck with them.
One thing that you sort of bring up in the book is how a lot of them are specifically tied to Western science, which you make a great point about, is that it's become such a strong brand that we don't even put the Western in front anymore. Could you just explain that point?
The gist of it is understanding that advances in science and technology in the West serve political ends, and they always have, but also acknowledging that knowledge can come from other places. So one story that I worked on really hard for a very long time that didn't make it into the book is about the history of vaccination. When we learn about vaccination at school, Edward Jenner, one genius-eyed guy who came up with this idea. No mention at all about the fact that there have been practices in East Asia, so in China, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly West Africa, to do a process which is called variolation, which is this really disgusting thing, which is you take the smallpox, you grind it up, and you either snort it or put it into a broken wound on the skin. That knowledge from Western Africa came to North America through enslaved people. They brought their knowledge with them. It was when Cotton Mather, who is a very famous person in the history of the US, happened to speak to one of the people he had enslaved to ask about this technique that whose name was Onesimus, it's important we name him, who said that he had had this done when he was a child and had never caught smallpox since, that suddenly Western scientists, doctors started to take it seriously. Like I said right at the top, anyone can do science. All of this knowledge does exist. It's just a lot of what constitutes the science that we see today comes from... It's always been a global project. It's always been an international project. But those people don't get the credit. And let's take the example of vaccines, particularly what happened fairly recently in our history in the last couple of years. Who was manufacturing the COVID vaccine and who was getting access to it and where was it? It only just so happens, actually, that because African countries were so good about their lockdown procedures, they didn't need the vaccine in such wide numbers. But if we go back to the previous global pandemic, which was AIDS, so many people, the only reason the medication became affordable in South Africa or in Southern Africa was because of so much activism on the part of people saying, you know what, we deserve to live too. Yeah, it might have cost you to make these drugs, but you really should be selling them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well on the point of like Western ideas infiltrating parts of our daily lives, science is a huge area, and also even grief. You have a great section in the death chapter about how Western ideas of the key thing is to returning everyone to a hardworking unit of capitalism. So how has that made our attitudes in the West different to the rest of the world?
I think the way that I put it in the book is that in the West we keep death at arm's length. It's something that happens over there. And we can cite loads of examples from other parts of the world where grief and mourning happens in the home. Death was also a very female space in the West until fairly recently. So it's, or I should say, more of a woman's space. It was women of the house who took care of dead bodies. And so as a result, because of this distance, the argument I make is, first of all, it doesn't serve us well mentally. Grief is an important and an unavoidable aspect of our lives. I don't mean to diminish it at all. It's really, it's a fundamental aspect. But the other point I make in the book is societies that keep death closer to hand are better at taking care of the living as well. And so I think, again, for all of the wonders of the advancement of modern technology, we still have to work out what it is that makes a life worth living.
That reminds me of the section on Haiti's zombies. Could you just talk a little bit about why you wanted to shine a light on that in the book?
The story was you had a couple of researchers, one who was based at a university in the UK, one who was based at a university in Haiti, went and met people who claimed to be zombies, or at least their families who were taking care of them claimed that they had come back from the dead. And what these researchers did was, in addition to diagnosing probably a great, with those three cases, there was instances of learning disabilities, but also mental illness and also some brain disease as well, as far as some of these people were concerned. They did DNA tests as well. And the DNA tests categorically proved that the zombies, who people were claiming to be family members, not related in any way, shape or form. Now, I don't want to sound all like kumbaya about the whole thing. There were aspects to do with property and inheritance, and there's money and power involved in these scenarios as well. But just the fact that you would, these are not rich people. The fact that you would be willing to take another person into your home and take care of them as if they were a member of your own family, possibly for some financial gain at some point, but just the doing of that is just astonishing to me. It's just astonishing to me, because what do we do with people in our society who suffer from mental illness, who suffer from brain disease, who as they get older might have dementia? We away. They're away. They're the zombies, right? They're the problem. What do we do with our zombies? We push them away. We don't keep them close at hand. And so that's why scientifically this is not an important story, but I think for the sake of our humanity, it really spoke to me.
Just finally, to wrap it up, given everything that we've discussed and what you learned during the research for your book, how would you encourage people watching this to view science going forward?
I want them to view science in not a straightforward way. Up until now, science has been a really blunt instrument. And I want for people to understand that actually it's a two-edged sword. The point that I make, again, in the first chapter is when science was used to create the idea of race, and when science was used to prop up ideas to do with racial hierarchy, the real power behind being able to do that was it meant that whoever was put at the bottom of that hierarchy no longer had the means to speak to their own humanity. So for those of us who are not racialized as white, we can't prove it, right? It's for some reason it's up to, because that's how the science works, right? It's up to me to prove my point of view, right? But when it comes to people's humanity, that's not a viable way of looking at the world. And it's why some really hideous people who hold on to the idea of race, who hold on to these ideas to do with differences in intelligence, who hold on to the idea that women are somehow inferior to men because of their, all of these sorts of things, they are able to use science as a blunt instrument. And what I would want for anyone who reads the book, who listens to this, or anyone really who thinks about living in the world, is how can the science serve us better rather than be used just to beat up on other people.
Thank you for that, like, truly interesting conversation. It was great, and thoroughly enjoyed reading your book as well. So thank you so much for your work and your time.
I'm really happy to hear you love the book, and I put words in your mouth there, but yes, you did. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
It's been a pleasure.